Good afternoon. This is Brian Barnes at Coretek. We're just going to give everybody 1 or 2 more minutes before we get started. Today's event, IT Security Service, is internal or external right for you? Another minute or so and we'll get going. Great. Thanks everybody for attending. It looks like we got a great audience today. My name is Brian Barnes. I'm the Chief Technology Officer at Coretek Services. I'm super excited to introduce our guest speaker, Brian Herr, who's our Chief Operations Officer, Chief Information Officer, as well as our Chief Security Officer. Today's topic is IT Security Services, and internal and external, is it right for you? Brian's been in the industry for a long time, along with myself, and Coretek Services is both an Azure expert MSP, a security services provider, along with a lot of other cloud journey and motions that we do for our customers. So, Brian, I'm going to kick it over to you, and then we can get going.
Oh, thanks, Brian. Oh, great to have people showing up and supporting us in this messaging. I know some of you have seen some of this content before. We've done workshops on it, and we really wanted to make everything available to the broader audience, especially as more people are engaging in managed services. So with that, let's go ahead and kick it off. Quick intro for myself. I'm Brian Herr, as mentioned earlier. I've been in the industry 27 years now. About 20 of it has been in the managed services side. More than 20 different verticals supported. I think I counted more than 600 or 700 customers at this point. Been doing this a while. And with that, I've been able to gather a lot of information and experience that I'll be sharing today. So what we're going to walk through is really just a quick recap of what brings us here to this discussion. Taking a look at what your needs are and working through the process of where does it make sense to do a service provider, where can you gain some value, and really how does it update and address your program needs when it comes to services, and then what do you keep in house? How do you make that decision? And we'll cover that. And at the end, we'll open it up for some question and answer. Please, if there's anything that pops up along the way, please drop it in the chat. Brian will be able to bring it up if it's something we can address really quickly. If it's a bigger question, we may have to hit it at the end, so we'll parking lot it, but realize we will get your messages. We'll definitely address your questions. So a little bit of housekeeping. We tend to try to keep our slides very minimalistic, but since we do have a number of leaders from IT security and also procurement, we've added a little bit more detail into the slides. We won't be reading from the slides, so don't worry, but I do want to make sure that as you have questions, or if you take away the slides from the session, you can use them as checklists for your program, your procurement processes, and maybe even as part of your RFP process with your service providers. So we just want to make sure the content is there. When we talk about moving to managed services, there's really two groups we talk about, right? The first one is the small, medium businesses. They have a little bit different set of criteria, but it used to be they fit into a very smaller pocket. They could do everything on their own, a little more minimalistic. But what we're seeing now is a lot of the enterprise requirements are pushed into the small, medium businesses, but they have a smaller scale and oftentimes a smaller budget, and they may not have the same technical expertise. And this is really changing that whole ability for service providers or for small, medium companies to keep up with technology and times and the needs of the business, right? A lot more executives and boards are being tech savvy in what they're required to address as part of their organizational needs. Okay, then the other thing that's coming up quite a bit is there's a lot more exposure, not only on the technology needs, but also the security and the implications of what happens when cybersecurity fails. So it's changing the requirements on the small and medium businesses, not necessarily changing their budgets or their staffing levels. So that's something that's very unique to address, but there are ways to address it. The last piece on here is we're seeing an uptick in this segment and adopting managed services. They're seeing a better adoption at the management level that it is impossible to do it all in-house. And it makes sense to reach out either on a consulting side, managed services, maybe reaching out to, if there's other organizations, such as if there's a parent company, reaching out to that organization for help. It's just at a small scale, you can't do all of it. That's a real change versus 3 to 5 years ago. It used to be the expectation you would have 2 or 3 IT people and they'd have to try to accomplish everything. It's just not possible in today's world. Now, what's a little different is taking that a step further in the enterprise space. Many of the same requirements are there, but the biggest draw is the scale and complexity of enterprises, and maybe even within business units, because they act almost as like individual companies. And then the other piece is they tend to be a little bit farther along in their journey of managed services or having service providers. But in that case, they may have it for point solutions. So there's a certain degree of complexity that comes with managing multiple service providers and managing multiple technologies and platforms. So there's a lot more complexity to it, which is why you often see a higher need for overhead of more SMEs. There's a lot more cost involved. And then just having an organization that size, it's a lot more difficult to make large changes, make sweeping changes. And you have to factor that into your value proposition and how long it takes for change to happen, and you just see the benefits and the cost reductions. But in general, the programs are maturing and those organizations are getting better at procuring the right services for their needs. So people kind of fit into those buckets. There's always somebody that's an outlier, but that's really what I'm seeing is driving some of these discussions. So the first thing I really want to walk through with anyone who's doing this workshop or is leading as IT or security program, really take an inventory at a business level, and I'm going to break that down, an inventory of what are the contractual service level agreements, what are the organizational security risks. When I say organizational security risks, I'm not talking about patching. I'm talking about risk to people, risk to product, risk to production, risk to accounts receivable, risk to accounts payable, risk to partnerships and contractual agreements. These are the things that your senior leadership team are talking about and they're delivering to. They're delivering to SLAs. They're delivering to the board on these business outcomes. You have to be in a position where you're translating the needs of your IT and security program and those risks to the bigger picture business risks, because that's how you're going to get funding and you're going to get buy-in. If you go to non-technical leadership teams and explain technical things to them, you're going to get various degrees of adoption or even comprehension. And that's the reality of it. But if you can come back and say, I need to address these practical items, right? And that's taking that inventory, these practical items, and if I don't, or I don't fulfill those needs, this is the impact to the business. This is the impact to our ability to produce. This is the impact to our plants running, right? These are the things that people really understand. So making that gap, or bridging that gap, is going to be what's successful in your messaging. Taking that in, the next piece is you need to look at what are all the areas from a technology and security and availability perspective that your program, right, not just your team or whatever, your program needs to address. And then assign that to some of those organizational risks. Put it to tangible assets or outcomes that a business leader is going to understand that if we don't do this, these things are at risk and how much risk. If we don't do this fully, how does it impact productivity or the ability to deliver product? Or, right, you have to keep moving it up the ladder of comprehension by assigning all these pieces together. I tell everyone, listen, there are CIO and CISO mind maps out there that will help you understand and really look at what are the things I don't know I need to be looking at. People have mapped this out. You can go on the internet. Those mind maps are incredibly helpful. And you'll find that they'll basically fall within, and at least in the security realm, it's identify, protect, detect. How do you remediate? How do you recover? How do you learn and put it all together? Because that's what we're doing is we're protecting the business and making that how we address things. Okay. So taking the time to do that and understand what your inputs are is going to be incredibly important. The last piece, when you're thinking about your program, take a really good look at if we're trying to deliver these outcomes, right? These outcomes that we're putting together, do you have the right talent, the right experience? Do you have enough people enough hours in the day to cover what's required? Do you have the ability? Are you so busy being a technologist that you don't have time to actually run the program? Notice when I mentioned earlier, you're going to be going to the leaders and the board talking about, I need to address these needs in my program. We're not necessarily simply doing a I need to address these simple things from a technology perspective, right? I'm trying to produce outcomes in my program. I find, especially the small, medium-sized businesses, people can't seem to offload some of those technology tasks or very tactical tasks enough to be able to run their program, which is a bit of a disservice. And you'll see that most well underfunded programs I've seen did not have a leader that was working on the program versus working in the technology, right? And that's where, if you're going to make that shift, if you don't have the resources in-house, you need to start seeing what makes sense to go out to a third party so that you can manage those outcomes from that service or third party instead of managing all the technology if it doesn't make sense. I know we really went into those pieces, but at the end of the day, you're responsible for the outcomes of your program to your organization, and that's what the leaders are looking for. So we touched on this a little bit, in-house versus a service provider. There's a lot of debate here. There's no two organizations that are exactly the same, but you're going to have to take everything we just talked about, that gap analysis, that heat map to outcomes, risks. What is it you need to deliver? What is the organization's risk if you don't? And that's important, right? We covered this already. Because at the end of the day, I've seen a lot of organizations that are very reactionary, and because they didn't think ahead and they didn't walk through all the things they need to address, they kind of adopt if I can't address it now, I'm going to go ahead and ignore it so it doesn't matter. It still matters. And your leadership team needs to understand that there is a gap and it does matter. Now you're going to prioritize it. Some of it you might fix this year, next year. Some of it you might address 3 years out. You might do a compensating control. In other words, I'm going to do something that gets me good enough and we'll watch it, because there's not enough time and money in the world to address everything at once. It's just the reality of it. And part of our duties as a leaders in these organizations is to help set the right priorities and risks, help the business leaders understand the impacts. At the end of the day, they accept those risks and you make decisions based on it. And then if you're wrong, you address it. That's just how it works. And as part of this, you're going to have to really understand what are all the resources that go into fulfilling these needs in the program. And looking at all of my resources, does it make sense and make a value proposition for me to do it in-house? There used to be the idea that it was cheaper if I did it in-house because I can control the resources and technology better. The problem you run into is we know in business that through economies of scale, you gain pricing advantages, right? You have costing advantages. Everyone knows this. So the idea that a smaller organization or a single department can get a high efficiency costing model on their own, it's not likely. So I help leaders understand that you really need to focus on is looking at all the things you deliver, looking at your budget from people, technology, process, all those pieces. What makes sense to keep in-house because it is a very unique or very strategic deliverable or outcome that can only be done in-house. And then the next piece is things that are a little bit more commoditized or maybe done elsewhere, right? Whether it's another team, another business unit, parent company, or service provider, identify those items, find out the costs, and put that into your program so you can start articulating, here's what I need to deliver. Here's what really makes sense for us to do internally. And here's the stuff that really needs to be done by others. And these are the benefits that come with it. There's always risks when you involve third parties, but if you manage the risks and you manage the outcomes, you will get more value for your dollar and for your time, and you will address more of your needs in a shorter period of time. And I'm telling you this because I've been doing it for 20 plus years in the managed services side. And when people really take this to heart and pull apart what they're trying to deliver, they will always find efficiencies. Now, taking that through the next part of the life cycle, creating a plan is great, understanding all the pieces. It doesn't really get legs and buy-in until you start talking to the senior leaders. There's a lot of time spent talking to legal and the CFO and audit and compliance, and this is where your job as a leader changes. You're now going to become a business analyst as well as part salesman, saleswoman. At the end of the day, you're going to have to show what needs to be accomplished based on the objectives that the leaders understand. What are the risks the leaders understand? What needs to be addressed to fulfill those objectives? And then where are you at being realistic in your budget, and looking at a budget is not just money, but from hours in the day, as well as technology, resourcing, looking at all those pieces together. Where are you at? What's realistic? And then helping the organization understand, do you accept what we can deliver today based on what we need? Or let's talk about what's next. How do we shift next? And understand that in order to address these needs, and based on now understanding the leadership team's risk appetite and where they're going, what they're trying to address in the future, backing into, okay, in order to deliver that in acceptable levels, we really need to focus internally on these pieces. Here's items that we've never done before, so maybe that gets focused from internal. And here's things that we've historically not done well or not had time to get to. This goes to a third party, and then pick your appropriate third parties. Socialize the plan, let everyone understand, they can get buy-in, they can give feedback, and then you set your budget based on that. Set your program based on those inputs. It will change the way your leadership team looks at you and your program and your ability to deliver, because now you're aligning the task that you're trying to accomplish with the outcomes they're having to accomplish, right? The business outcomes, understanding business risks. This is how you elevate that conversation, and that helps set the table of, in this world, if we're going to do these pieces, and this is what goes to maybe goes to a service provider because it makes sense. It's commoditized or maybe done best by others who specialize and have scale, experience. The other thing I find is many times as an organization is trying to go through a security transformation, doing it in place is hard, but moving it to a service provider and maybe a cloud platform with security by design, it's already built in to meet the requirements. that migration to what's better and what's right is an easier proposition and a better cost value than trying to fix in place. So keep that in mind. Value to be found in the money you're already spending, either through platforming, right sizing, bundles. At the end of the day, you can do more for the dollar. I've never been in a position where someone came at me and said, my budget is 100% squeezed. We know exactly where we're at and we can't get any more value for the dollar. It never happens. In fact, just recently we were in an engagement with a customer. For this particular platform, they have about north of a $400,000 a year spend in Azure, and they needed to increase security, some compliance items. They had a want list. They did a very things, these bigger business objectives, right? Because this platform is very key to their business. What they did is they took that and they said, I have these gaps. And then they worked with us to really evaluate the security and compliance of their platform, but also the cost governance, the structure, the right sizing, platforming. At the end of the day, they were north of 400,000 for that particular platform and annual spend. There was $125,000 in savings and growing that were found. So what they did was very strategic. They already know they're spending that much. That's the trend. So what they did is they pulled it back. They realized the recommendations that came out of the advisory group. So there was a little bit of money up front, right? At the end of the day, they still end up saving the cost of that engagement. They moved to a managed service in a secured environment. They were able to pay for the additional things that they needed to accomplish with the dollars that were already allocated. And then at the end, once they met the risk thresholds, the risk appetite of the organization, they took the rest as a savings that they could use in other places in their budget. Right? That's how you find room in your budget and your spend to accomplish new things. The other thing that comes up a lot of times when we're prepping for a board presentation, if you're trying to accomplish in your program, right? Your program is a collection of all the tactical items that you need to accomplish. In that program, you relate it to the organization's business outcomes. What are their objectives? You relate it to organizational risks that the board is concerned with. And you can show where the spend and time contributes or protects the organization, keeping it out of the weeds. There's always money to be found for special cases and special projects. There's always ways to defend the budget you have. And the last piece is there's always a service provider to fit the need, in part or in whole, but there's always a service provider there. You need to, part of your job is understand your needs so you find the right one. Having that right service provider will be oftentimes the difference between a successful integration and a tumultuous integration, right? Picking those right partners that fit what your needs are. If you don't know your needs, it's going to be a very difficult discussion. So we're going to keep moving along. We talked a little bit about how do what is it that drives this need? How do you select what stays in house, what goes out, to a partner or a third party? In order to make that gap from theory to execution, you're going to have to select a partner. You're going to have to negotiate, and there's a few things that get learned along the way. Because I've been on both sides of the negotiation table when it comes to managed services, there's some things you learn. It's often I sit with my peers, right, and we compare notes. And one thing that comes up quite a bit is when we kind of talk about where some of our pricings are, people have found that I'm able to drive a little bit more discount or a little bit more, price to value than what they are, because I understand how the business runs on the back end. And this slide I'm going to walk through basically what I've learned over the years and how to negotiate with a managed service provider. To take this to note, when you're looking at a service provider, you absolutely have to know what you're trying to accomplish. So all the things we talked about before, what are your needs? What are you trying to cover? Are you trying to do something that's very specific, a point solution, single service? What are you looking for? Are you looking for something more holistic? And the reason I talk about that is when you have a service provider that is very much a point solution, they're very good at one or two very specific things. Their motivation is to get more consumption of that individual service or things. So driving that forward. So their dimension of scale is up. They want to scale up more units, more users, more endpoints, more of whatever. And your price breaks happen as you scale up. Understanding that is a real benefit because now you know how to negotiate. So if you understand that there's a scale up component, and maybe you have, as an example, maybe you're responsible for 3 sub companies. 2 of them are up for renewal on their antivirus or their endpoint detection software, right? They're for some software and service. The third one is going to be up for renewal, maybe instead of Q1, Q3. One thing that service providers really want to see is how can I add more in that one dimension? I want to see more scale up. Talk to them and say, listen, we're going to do the deal on these 2 companies right now. And we're going to get a provision in there that we're going to do this third company in Q3 so that I can negotiate that bundle price. And we put it into the contract that I don't start billing until that other company comes online. But we've all locked in a way to show that overall scale, then also talk about where you're going in the future. Maybe there's additional single lines, or maybe there's some additional features and modules that can be added over time. Showing that future vision and your planning and being very realistic and open, they can do a lot in negotiating pricing, price breaks, discounts, onboarding, education. There's a lot of things that can be had because they're seeing overall, where is this going? Is it going to be very small, or are we building a relationship over time? Now, there are other service providers that are in a slightly different dimension. In other words, they have one more. Not only do they care about scaling up, because there's efficiencies to be had when you scale up, but they also scale out. We know very well that it is harder to manage lots of customers doing only a few things. It's easier to manage a few really comprehensive customers you can get to know that you're doing more services with, right? So you can deepen the relationship, you can do scaling across products or services and up. So there's 2 dimensions to it. So if you keep that in mind, using a similar methodology that we talked about in scaling up, scaling out, using that as a motivator to have your service provider make you some price concessions, breaks. Maybe you're laying out a future roadmap and you're converting to more of these services. Say, hey, I'm going to convert these services over time. Let's get that in the contract now, and then we execute those pieces as they come online later in the year. There's a lot to be said about negotiating that up front because you have scale up and you have scale out. So keep those dimensions in mind. And then also what motivates your service provider. Are they tied to a particular partner? Is there some programs that they participate in? Are there certain technologies that they utilize that makes sense for your organization? So maybe it makes sense to switch that technology so they can take that over for you instead of trying to manage it yourself. And many times an organization that can implement and manage a particular technology or service, they're going to have really good knowledge on impacts and lessons learned because they've done it for other customers, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of times. By the experience, it comes with the product, and that's part of the value prop. And then the next piece is really be forthcoming in your budget and your future expectations. There's a lot of planning that goes into right sizing an account and figuring out what resources are needed. Be upfront and honest. If you have a budget for a Volvo and you're asking for a Ferrari, it makes it difficult. If you know that you have a budget that gets you to a certain place, and with some tweaking with your service provider, you can get there with a lot of value. That's part of the negotiation that can happen, right? You have to be very realistic and upfront. The next piece, I see this a lot. There's a certain bit of partner versus vendor. A partner builds a relationship, has open communication, and it happens in both directions. That's a partnership, because there's in any services, there's going to be trials and tribulations. Any technology, there's going to be trials and tribulations. It's how you get through it together that's going to dictate whether it's successful or not. If you have a relationship where you expect a partner and you have selected someone that operates more like a vendor, which is very transactional, it's going to cause friction. If it goes the other way, it's going to cause friction. So make sure, either if you want a vendor, get a vendor, someone who's transactional, does exactly what they're supposed to do. There's no value add beyond exactly what they're providing. If you want more interaction, you want more integration with your teams, you want the value add, select a partner, but that means you need to be a partner back. I can tell you, in partner programs, we have the ability on the back end of service providers to help you, make you aware of what's coming. Like if there's new products or services coming, you can be early adopters, price reductions. You can be part of a feedback group, which gives you price reductions, might give you access to new technologies or insight. You get to have more influence on what your service provider does in the future. Having that relationship is very important, because we only have so much time and what I'll call investment dollars that we can move around between our customers and our partners. So if you're on the right side of that, you will get more benefit than what you're paying for, because you're being that good partner in the other direction. So keep that in mind. And then the next piece, this comes up quite a bit. I see in small and medium businesses, I see it in enterprises to varying degrees, but really understanding, if you're going to work with a service provider or a service in general, is it better to have good enough, right? They have good and they have great, but it all mixed together to blend out to be good enough. It's all integrated, maybe, works together already, and it offsets more of what you're trying to accomplish. So you get more of an outcome versus a very tactical task or technology. Or does it make sense to get a great point solution that only does a very select piece? Now, keep in mind, if you have point solutions and you have integrated solutions and you have your own in-house stuff, it is on you and your organization to integrate and interoperate all those items. So we're seeing a shift where it used to be, I want to have the greatest of technology and services and people and all these things. But people really started to learn the lesson that that's great, but if it's not implemented correctly, it's not interoperationally efficient, you really lose cost value. A lot of times it's not functioning the way you want it. You're going to be replacing it eventually. It takes a lot of effort to tie these things together. Now, some enterprises, they have the bandwidth and the resources, the people, that they're already handling so much in-house that they can go after a point solution. Or maybe they're blending a couple specific strategic point solutions or services together into a bigger play. I'm seeing a bigger push in the small, medium-sized businesses where they can't afford a full department, so they're moving into this comprehensive model. I'll give you kind of an example. A more pointed solution maybe is an EDR service, that endpoint detection and response service. Okay, so someone is monitoring your security, and because all they have access to is a little bit of the technology, so if something bad happens, they can quarantine the one machine, and then they call your team and say, hey, we've done this much, the rest is on you, because this is as far as we can get, right? They just don't have access. They're not integrated into the other technologies, just not there yet. That works great for some organizations because they have everything else covered in spades. Like they have the incident response teams, the technology teams, like everything's ready to go. So what they're really looking for is a monitoring service. What we're seeing the other side is many organizations like that, I don't have all of the underlying people and infrastructure, so they're changing it and they're looking for more of an integrated service, where the security service is turning around saying, hey, we detected something. We investigated it for you. Based on your existing decision tree, we've quarantined the user, we've quarantined the device. We've sent a ticket over to the integrated service desk, and they are helping us pull the machine from the user. As soon as the machine is pulled, the integrated operations center, IT engineering, has already kicked off a case to take that machine, get it an image, and then start wiping it so that we can use that image, or we can return that laptop in a clean state. Or maybe it's something else. Maybe we've already reached out to the on-site resources, we've used an autopilot, and we've just sparking up a brand new laptop. Your user will be back up and running while we do the investigation in an hour. Right? That's the more holistic delivery that people are starting to look for in the small, medium business. And even enterprises are saying, if you can do that, that's farther along, because you can focus on the other outcomes. Maybe that special application that was homegrown. Maybe your resources go from being technologists to architects. Your project managers aren't necessarily managing a technologist, but they're now managing product and outcomes for the business. It changes how much in the weeds you have to be with the technology. And then as you're doing this and you get to more of that good integrated platform, so you have more of your managed services in a group that understands how all the pieces go together. Managed services really focus on automation, optimization. They're doing things at scale. You can absolutely use the templates and the knowledge that they've already brought to the table, and as part of the service, they should be adding that value to your organization. So keep that in mind. If you're not in a position to automate or to optimize things, your service provider's probably already done it for others. See if it's a service they offer. So we're going to keep moving along. I know we've covered a lot. I want to thank everyone. This has been a great session. I'm sure some people are going to reach out and ask for more information afterward. Please feel free. If there's any questions out there, this is a good time to address them.
Yeah, Brian, we do have a question. What is the biggest mistake you see when a company is first engaging with a service provider?
Oh, that's a really good question. A lot to unpack there. What I typically see is if there's not a good alignment of expectations, the delivery and onboarding of the service can have issues. And then there's also, you have to understand that anytime you're making a change to an organization, you're getting into a new relationship with a partner, there's going to be a period of time of getting to know each other. There's going to be some trials and tribulations. It's how you come out of it that's going to set the tone for the partnership. And most of the time I find when an organization is engaging with a partner, it's because they have a need of where something is either not delivered today or under-delivered. So you need to be very realistic that there's going to be a learning curve. There's going to be a little bit of time required to get things to where you expect it. It's not a day one. It's a great question, Brian.
Awesome. Another question just popped in. What are some good ways to help offset the cost of service providers?
Yeah, another great question. So we covered this a little bit earlier. If you can leverage every bit of value out of your service provider and look at all the things that they can deliver versus what you're paying for today, platforming, service, software consolidation, license consolidation. A lot of times your partners have tools, methods, relationships with the vendors to help you with that. And also looking at the governance of your infrastructure, right? Some of those other items, I see it a lot in the cloud side especially. There's money to be found in what you're already spending. Mind that, because no one's budgets are infinite. It just doesn't happen. So you need to get as much value for the dollar. And if you don't know what you're trying to accomplish, you don't necessarily understand what are all the efficiencies I can gain from an existing platform or service provider. So keep that in mind. There's often overlap, even between departments, in what a software or program or platform does. Look at it from a big picture. how do we harmonize that so that we have consistent platforms and software delivery? Can we use more out of a service provider to get that volume discount? With that, you get more value for the dollar.
Yeah, great question. Thank you for that one. Third question, how important is it for certifications of an MSP, things like ITIL or ISO certifications?
One of the things that if you're going to be trusting your environment and your security, your company's outcomes to a partner, you need some kind of third-party validation that they are up to the standards that is required for you. And that's what these certifications do, right? You have an ISO 27001, which is looking at their program. What's their security program look like? A lot of times you'll see a SOC 2 Type 2. That's looking at the security and how well they operate their own program and service. Okay, ITIL processes, using standards that everyone understands and agrees upon in the language of delivery. That's important. You don't want miscommunication because this group, this service provider, this third party has to be an integrated part of your organization. Now, with that being said, this is where I see a bit of a learning curve. If you are not really good in some of these areas, that's part of the value of moving to a service provider. They're going to help you move to being a little bit more refined in how you handle things like change management and ITIL processing and documentation, all the things that IT people and security people wish they had time for. Service providers have to do that by design.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks, Brian, for that response. Any other questions that are out there? I'll give everybody another 10 seconds or so to submit before we end. And while we're waiting for that, I just want to thank everybody today for attending. We had a great attendance list today, and thank you, Brian, for your time. If there's any information that you need about Coretek, please go to coretek.com. As an MSP and an MSSP, there's something that we're really focused on providing these types of services for our customers. On top of that, since there's no more questions, I just want to thank everybody for their time. And thanks again, Brian, for your time today.
Yeah, thanks, everybody.
Have a great day.